Hi, welcome to the third part of my video series where we will take and read PDF file that contains a report from Maryanne, move it to text, and then turn it into data. In the first two parts, we dealt with the installation of Alteryx R so that we can use the R widget to extract the text from the PDF. Part two, we looked at the couple of macros that I created to help me with converting data, and then I can reuse these macros anywhere that I need them in any other workflows that I develop. And in this part three, we will look at the multi-row formula, which can be a bit complex and overwhelming the first time you see it, and we'll use that to consolidate the header and detail format of this reporting data that we've extracted. As a refresher, let's take a look at the data that we're reading in. We've already worked on getting the information out of the header and footer of this report. And now what we need to do is to deal with these sections of data that are in the report. What we have in this section, and that's repeated, is we have the information about the puppy that Maryanne sends to us, so we know exactly which of our puppies training are being costumed up. Then for each puppy, she gives us the date that she sewed their costume and the cost of creating or fixing that costume as well. And we want to bring these out so we can reference them to each individual puppy. And to do that, we will use the multi-row formula. The multi-row formula gives you the ability not just to operate upon one row in your data stream, but if you're at a specific row, it'll let you see rows that have already passed down the stream and those rows that have not yet arrived in the stream. And they're referenced as row for the current row, row -1, row -2 for the records that have passed through, and row +1, row +2, etc. that have yet to pass through this widget. You can define how big a window you want to use in your processing so that you can see and calculate depending upon what has already come through. Potentially the most complex of the processing that you need to be concerned about is the ability to identify which are header records and which are detail records. In this case, it's pretty easy because Maryanne in her bill has gone ahead and indented the detail records as opposed to the header records. And what this looks like in our data set then, that is processed out of the PDF into text. This is where we're working on this within billing details. We look at the data, we see that very nicely, because of the operations we took to extract this data, the detail column appears as field 1, and then the actual billing records, costume name, billing date, etc., appeared as a separate field. And so we can see that for the header detail record, the header record that has the puppy details in it, the costume name, etc., are nulled out. We didn't actually do this. It's the way the data looked. And so this gives us a very easy way of recognizing the header as opposed to the actual billing records. So doing that, we want to invoke in our preparation, we have the multi-row formula. We pull that down. It gives us the ability to decide whether we want to update an existing field or to create a new field. In this case, we want to go ahead and update the puppy detail field. What we want to do is to get this information, which is the puppy's identifying characteristics, placed at the beginning of each of these records, so that then our record will have this detailed information about the puppy at the beginning of each of the individual billing items. Couple things that you need to look at is to determine the number of rows that you want to see in addition to the current row. And so I've chosen 1, and this allows us to see the previous record, 1 previous record, the current record, and 1 not yet come through record. So again, row -1 is a record that has already gone through the previous record. Row +1 is the next record that has yet to come through, and +0, or just row, is our current row. If I chose 2, hit the apply button, or click on white space. I'm not sure exactly what that apply button does, because it doesn't really seem to update it pretty quickly. We see now we have row -2, row -1, which are the 2 previous records, and then 2 following records. We don't need to actually see that many. We only need to see 1. So go back to 1. Interesting choice you have to do is to the values for rows that don't exist. What this talks about is what value does the record have if you're at the beginning or end. So the first row that we see will not have a previous row, and the last row will not have a next row. And what value do we want to give to it? In this case, I've just chosen null. It doesn't really affect us. But again, you can choose a couple of other options in here, depending upon what your needs are. Experiment with it within your existing case. You want to build the expression for what you're going to do with each individual record. You build it down here in expression. You have building blocks up here where you can look for and use your functions. Again, recommend that you experiment with these functions in the formula before you begin to process it inside of the multi-row formula, because you don't have quite as good an interface. Simply what we want to say in this data is that if the current record has an empty puppy details, then we want to pull down the puppy details from the previous record. What this means in this context is that for the first record, the actual detailed information about the puppy, the header record, will not be empty, and therefore we won't take any action. But if this record, which is the first billing record, has an empty puppy information, then I will pull this down into here. When the second record comes through, or the third record in this case, the second billing record comes through, then it also will be empty, but we've already placed the puppy detail header information into this record, so it will begin to flow into each of these until we hit another header, in which case then this information will not be modified, and it will flow into each of the subsequent records through this formula. Very standard processing for the multi-row formula. We do that by simply saying if the puppy's details are empty, then we give it the row -1 puppy details. That's flowing it from each of the previous records forward. Otherwise, if it is not empty, we keep it as its current value. Again, you will need to experiment with how you want to identify and move your data around, but it gives you the building blocks of the previous records and the next records to accomplish this. So what you see, if you look at the results, is that for our Abram the Boxer, this is the header record with null values for the billing information, and those details about the puppy have passed forward into each subsequent billing record that appears for that puppy. We then hit another header, and then that header information flowed through each of the details, and that got repeated through. Pretty straightforward once you see how it works and you get used to using it. The next thing we want to do is that we can use a filter. Because we simply do not want to see all of the header records, just the detailed records that are now properly anointed. It has the detailed information about the puppy, then the billing record for the name, the bill date, and the bill amount text. This is now able to process it, but in order to match this puppy up to its dimension record, we need to separate out each of these fields. And we can go ahead and do that with one that we've used many times. And that is we use the text to columns. So we can separate out puppy details into each puppy record using a comma delimiter. This gives us 4 fields for the puppy. The puppy's name, its breed, the kennel, and finally their birth date. You notice we have a warning here that you have leading spaces associated with these. Because each of the records was separated by a comma and a space, we were only able to split them out by a comma, so we need to trim off the extra spaces that are associated with these 3 fields. First, what we'll want to do is simply rename them. We don't need puppy 5 nor any of the puppy detail record anymore. We just simply need each of these individual records. And then we could create formulas to trim each of these individually. But I wanted to introduce another widget that I use, the multi-field formula. Again, this one is a little tricky to use the first time you see it. Simply, I went to identify through type. In this case, I have chosen all the text fields. I choose which of the text fields I want this formula to apply to. So I'm going to apply it to all of these text fields that came about from separating the fields to columns. And then what I want to do is to work on what I want that formula to do. The simple part is that I want to trim each of those fields. And I do that because there's a special tag in here that says this is the current field. So I want to trim the current field that I am using. So that way it'll apply to each of these 4 fields will be trimmed within the single widget and the single formula. Pretty much a shortcut, much easier to use than having to apply the same function in a formula with a reference to all 4 columns. As you can see when we're done, we have a good formatted record. Each of the fields has now been trimmed so we don't have a warning. It has a good name. I now need to process the text billing dates and the text billing amounts into actual fields. This becomes very easy because I have my macros. I run my string to number against the bill amount. I then run my birth date text through my BMY to date. And I do the same thing for my billing date text. I then can create a nice record that no longer uses the text fields for the dates or numbers, but actually uses dollar amounts and dates. So now my record has in it the puppy identifying information with an actual birth date, the billing information for each record with a date and a numeric bill amount, the invoice date and the supplier name that came from the header, and then just an invoice total amount just for me to use for further reporting. We can look at this and see the data types associated. And then I would simply save this into my data warehouse as a working table. So then I can then put this information into a billing data mart. So I can generate some costing reports for our little puppy training center. Takeaways from this video is don't be afraid of your multi-field or your multi-row. They can help get you out of some sticky situations. Experiment with how you would use them and where you would use them. As always, subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I will answer them. If you have some more requests for what you would like to see or maybe some different application for some of these widgets, also drop me a comment and I will make a video to assist you. Thanks for watching.